United States Constitution. It's almost never talked about anymore, and it's sad because it's something I've spent probably the last decade of my life studying, researching, and it's a great document. I think it's really, it's kind of cool. But on a serious note, the reason we're going to talk about this today is because politics is so insane and things are so crazy. It is almost kind of like a lawless Wild West where anything goes. And I've sat back and I just thought, is there no limit to what people think the government can do? Do they just think they can do whatever they want? It's amazing to me that a lot of people think that if the federal government is doing it, then it can do it, and that's just, we have to deal with it. And it's just not the case. It's never been the case. So I'm doing this podcast to remind people that Congress, the president, the courts, they all have severe limits. In fact, they only have limited things they can do. And I think it's about time we remind people of what those things are. At least to some degree. We're not going to get too specific. In any case, you can't talk about the Constitution without first talking about the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is amazing because it, at least as far as I'm aware, was the first time where these fundamental truths, I think, were just written out for the world to see. That all men are created equal, that the reason we even have government in the first place is to protect and preserve all these rights that we're born with. To me, and I think for a lot of us, we take this for granted, but for this time period, and even for the standard of today, I would say, for most of the world, this is still a concept that hasn't reached everyone. Not all cultures are really receptive to this kind of idea. And it's almost, I think, in our human nature to kind of succumb to tyranny in one form or another. But the American experiment, as it's often called, was different. We came together and thought of, well, what's a better way to say this? I think we took lessons from history and lessons from some of the great historians and philosophers of the past, and it converged into this one moment where these brilliant people came together and articulated the words in a way that had never been articulated and never been declared in this capacity before. And it was a beautiful thing. So then we fight the war, we win, but now we have this monumental task of taking these words and putting them into action. And so what I've always said is that the Constitution is now the physical manifestation of the Declaration of Independence put into government form. It puts a form, a government, a structure to those principles of the Declaration of Independence. But I think it's important to remember why. Why care about the Constitution? Why does it even matter in the first place? I mean, it certainly doesn't matter, as we said earlier, that it doesn't matter. Was it even brought up at all during any Democratic debate? How about, I mean, at any point during any of these Democratic debates? Was it brought up by any of the not constitutional Republicans, even during the Republican debates? I can't remember now. Probably the only person talking about it was Ted Cruz, which is why I liked him. But the best reason that I can come up with, and actually I can't even take credit for it, this was Mark Levin. He put this idea in my head in his first book, Liberty and Tyranny. He basically asked the question, I'm paraphrasing, when a lawmaker ignores the laws that govern his own conduct, meaning what he can and cannot do, what binds anyone to his laws that he passes? So if the laws of yesterday don't apply today, then why do the laws of today apply tomorrow? And he would go on to ask, doesn't lawlessness beget lawlessness? And he's exactly correct. It exactly does. And it's an interesting concept. Why should we listen to rules from, let's say, the IRS? Well, no, actually, they were technically constitutionally created thanks to the god-awful 16th Amendment. But that's a different story. Let's take, like, the EPA, for example. Why should we listen to any EPA regulation when Congress doesn't even have, the federal Congress doesn't have authority to regulate on that? They simply don't. It's an interesting question, an interesting thought. Why are we listening to rules that they don't even have the power to legislate on? And why do we let them get away with it? Which kind of is a good segue into Article 1, the creation of the Congress. There are two main problems that you need to know about Congress, and the first comes from this idea and these notions of the General Welfare Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clauses found in Article 1. I believe it's Section 8. Well, Section 8 I know is the General Welfare Clause. Necessary and Proper Clause I think comes towards the end of Article 1. In any case, they're read basically together to imply the same thing, that Congress can basically do whatever it wants so long as it improves and is good for the general welfare of the country. And this simply is not true. It's just simply not the case if we're going to read the Constitution and its history. What's interesting about the General Welfare Clause and Necessary and Proper Clause is that this was a factor that came up during the creation of the Constitution, during the Constitutional Convention. One of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, was actually supportive of a more expansive view of Congress and its roles and what it could do. He wanted Congress to be able to do whatever it wanted so long as it was in the name of the general welfare. His proposal, unfortunately for him, was unanimously rejected because it just, for obvious reasons, wasn't conducive with a limited government. And so what they did come up with is roughly 18 to 20 things, depending how you count it, 18 to 20 things that Congress can do. They can be found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and the last two in Section 9, which are more or less conditional powers. And there are other letters too. Thomas Jefferson is another advocate of this Madisonian idea. There are letters written by Thomas Jefferson to other people who were asking questions about this as well, and he clarified the intent of the framers of that time period. And again, in the Federalist Papers, Madison would go on to say the exact same thing, and I believe Federalist Paper 41, that he basically made the case, why would we, for the opponents that are saying that, this clause is going to be abused, like it is exactly being abused today, he would say, why would we go through the trouble of listing all these specific things and then at the very end or the very beginning say, listen, you also have the General Welfare Clause, which means you can do whatever you want. Why would we not just leave it there? Just leave Article 1, Section 8, do whatever you want. Pass whatever law you want, tax and spend however you want, so long as you think it's for the general welfare of the country. That was his basic case. Why list it out when we just could write that? So obviously the notion, the idea that those two clauses give any sort of power to the Congress is simply incorrect and is not the intention of the framers and wasn't actually, it wasn't the case. But as we've seen in our lifetimes, that the idea of a limited Congress has kind of evaporated and has bred, actually, I think, to be the number one problem we see in the Congress today. And that is its abdication of its legislative abilities and legislative powers into the executive branch. And not even into the executive branch in the form of the president, but just into these agencies. And a good example of this, again, actually is the EPA. So what's interesting, if we could look at the picture as a whole, is that Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate the environment. It simply doesn't. It's not listed in Article 1, Section 8 or Section 9. And yet it has taken this authority, it just declared that it has it, it grants this authority to an executive agency, and then this executive agency exercises legislative powers, executive powers, and judicial powers. It exercises all three of them, all within the executive branch, which clearly is a violation of our idea of separation of powers. Which, speaking of the administrative state, and that's what it's become. Now we have countless agencies and bureaucracies and subdivisions and also who knows how many there are, really. There's probably hundreds of them. Which is a good segue into Article 2, the presidency. Now, to be fair, this is the article I've probably studied the least amount on, especially compared to Article 1 and Article 3. But that's also partly because the literature on Article 1 is much larger. Article 3 is almost nothing. It seemed to be not only for the framers and for the people ratifying the Constitution and the ratification conventions. Article 1 seemed to be the most important one that people want to discuss. Article 2 would be next. Article 3 would be next after that, obviously. But as far as the president is concerned, there are some interesting things going on. The most interesting one I have researched out is the president's power to declare, well, to initiate wars, let's say. There's an interesting conversation going on among conservatives and constitutionalists that can be separated into two classes, one being the congressionalists and one being the presidentialists, basically, which means that the Congress initiates war or the president initiates war. And they both have some interesting arguments on both sides. And because there isn't a lot of clear language, and even the history is a little bit iffy and unclear as to how executives acted back in the day and how they should be applied under our Constitution, I tend to, after looking at all the evidence, support the idea that support the presidentialists, where the president does have the power. He's the commander-in-chief. He does have the power to control them and initiate and start altercations and whatnot. And the reason I say that is because clearly, if the Congress has a problem with that, they can always restrict resources. They always have power of the purse, and that is an extremely powerful piece of power that they have over the president. So the idea that they have the power to declare, and another reason for that is the language to declare war. It originally was to make war, which would basically be to initiate war, but that was changed to declare war, which is very different. And the presidentialists say that you can declare war, which then changes legal relationships across countries and within countries. It changes kind of a legal status, or changes legal statuses about what's happening. So I think the idea that the Congress... Congress did attempt to curb those powers of the presidency, I believe with the War Powers Act, but as far as I'm aware, the presidents have just largely ignored that and have conducted themselves as they saw fit, saying that they are the president and the commander-in-chief, and it's very interesting. Do I think presidents can start wars? I mean, it's interesting. I said yes earlier, and I still kind of believe that, because I'm thinking on the spot now. They have to realize that they're a super public figure. Popularity matters. They have to act intelligently, is what I'm trying to get at. They can't just start a war all willy-nilly if they know they don't have the support. They know that if they're going to do anything, they're going to need the support of Congress, regardless of whether or not Congress declares war or not, because they're going to need the power of the purse to fund whatever he is doing. So that's where I stand. That's why I think I am more of a presidentialist, if you will. Which leads us to Article 3. For me, Article 3 is the worst branch of government. It is the one that is the most tyrannical. And the reason for that is that purely there's no recourse from whatever action they do. If the Supreme Court comes out with a case, then that decision is binding, and there's basically nothing you can do about it. And to me, this is just a horrible principle of liberty, the idea that there is no recourse. Almost everywhere else in the Constitution, if someone is being bad or terrible or whatever, if they're just being bad, they can be removed. You have an impeachment process. Congress has an interesting process where they can get rid of members. Presidents can be impeached. Judges can be impeached, but it doesn't qualify if they rule against the Constitution. There's no punishment for that listed. Although I would argue there is, because there is this clause where they have to take an oath of affirmation, and I feel like if you violate that, you're violating the Constitution. But that's for a different podcast. But what's interesting about Article 3 ultimately is that it was a branch designed to be the least powerful. It was designed to be this branch that only had the power of interpretation, which by itself had no will, so they weren't allowed to be basically subjective, and they had no force. They couldn't make anyone do anything. They had to rely on the executive to almost agree with them, which is, I think, kind of an interesting concept, at least how Hamilton put it in one of the Federalist Papers. But one of the concerns from an anti-Federalist, and I think he was exactly right, I believe it was Brutus, who some believe was Robert Yates of New York, he would go on to say that no, this is going to be this branch of government is going to become a super legislature. And I think for all of us, that's pretty obvious what it is. It can basically nullify acts of Congress. It can nullify acts of the president. And like you said, there's no recourse from it. So for me, the courts have become the most tyrannical feature in American government. And they're ridiculous and people need to stand up to them. Both Congress needs to limit the purview of their scope, and presidents need to step up to them because the courts are just ridiculous. And they're by their nature, they're the most insulated from the people. There's no public input. The president nominates him, a Senate confirms him. Even then, if the idea the Senate was supposed to be a representative of the states, it wasn't supposed to be a representative of people. That was the purpose of the House of Representatives. It was called the People's House. And then when they're nominated, well, I should say when they're confirmed, they have lifetime appointments. They cannot be removed except for these pretty high crimes and misdemeanors, as it's said. And you can't affect their salaries. And there's no recourse from their decisions. It sounds to me like this was definitely the weakest part of the Constitution. In fact, I would argue it 100% is, of the original Constitution, that is. And last but not least, the fourth branch of government. And this is a branch of government that is not taught at all, but it clearly exists, and it is called the administrative state, as I believe Mark Levin would call it. Now, and like we said earlier, with what the first problem with Article 1 is that Congress has abdicated its legislative-making abilities to executive agencies. We listed one, that being the EPA, but there are, who knows how many, hundreds of them. Who even knows how many? And then among those, there's the subdivisions and the other bureaucracies and bureaus. The EPA is not the only isn't the only executive agency exercising all three powers. And all of these guys every day are making up laws and rules that affect you and I, and we don't even know what they are. We don't know what these guys are doing. This is what people might call a shadow government. Who knows? I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but all you need to know is that they do exist, they are out there, and no one knows what they're doing. So you can make up the name for it, I won't. And we'll stop there, we'll conclude there. I think what we'll do from here is, I think a fun thing we can do, send me questions about the Constitution, and I will answer the best ones that I can find, and we'll go from there. So on the next podcast, we'll do a Q&A on the Constitution. Till next time, guys.